Let's now finally render the recipe in the user interface. And so let's start by creating a new views file here. So recipe view.js, and then also right away import it here. Okay, and I'm simply duplicating this line here and replacing search with recipe. Okay, so again, we're going to import everything into recipe and then use these different functions as like methods on this recipe view object. Okay, so the most important function that we want in recipe view here is to, of course, render the recipe. So export and render recipe, where we put in, and I forgot, of course, the equal sign. So we put in the recipe and then we render the markup that we're going to create here. So just like before, we create a variable called markup and give ourselves a nice template string. This here should be mark up. And now let's actually get our HTML code here. So we have an element called recipe already in our DOM, and what we're going to insert in here is basically all of this HTML code here. So all of this. So let's grab it. And that was too much. So that is our HTML. So let's get ahead and paste it here. Whoa, what's going on here? That doesn't look correct at all. Okay, so that is a lot of code and it looks quite confusing. So let's figure out what exactly we have to replace here. So first off, we have the image here. And so that's the first thing that we're going to replace. And so remember, we passed in recipe, and the recipe is obviously the recipe object. And so in there we have the property called img. And so that's where the URL to our image is stored. So image. Then as an alt text, let's just use the title. So recipe.title. Okay. And I'm actually going to go ahead and copy this one here because it's really always the same. Then in here, we also have the title. Okay. Then down here, let's create some space here. We have the recipe details. So we start with the time. And so in here, we want the recipe time. So instead of 45, it's the custom time. Then here it is the servings. So 4 servings, and now it is recipe.servings. Let's take a look if that's correct. So yeah, so we have time and servings, right? Down here, we don't really have anything important for now. And then next up, we have the ingredients, and it's this huge list of stuff. And for now, let's get rid of this. Not all of it, but at least all of them but one. Okay, and so I'm going to come back to the ingredients a bit later here. For now, I just want to finish with the directions, where we have the publisher here. So the pioneer woman turns into recipe.author, and then finally down here we have the URL. So that's where the directions of this recipe actually are. So our API doesn't return us the directions on how to cook the recipe. It just gives us the link where the user can then go ahead and find it. Okay, so that is the markup here now, except the ingredients. And before we move on, let's actually render it here with insert adjacent HTML. And so let's go ahead to our, where is it? Yeah, our base file, and create a field here for recipe. And then go ahead and select that element. So document.querySelector. And remember that is actually called recipe also in the DOM. So give it a save, close it. And so we actually didn't import it yet. Okay, so let's simply copy it from this one here, so that we can now use it in here. So elements dot recipe, insert adjacent HTML. And this one we want right at the beginning. So after begin, and of course, markup. All right, and now about our ingredients here. So of course we don't know beforehand how many ingredients there are going to be. And so we have to do it here obviously with a loop. Okay, so what we're going to do here is to basically take our ingredients and then loop over them. And so remember that inside a template string, we cannot only just put in the variables, but we can do all kinds of stuff. So recipe.ingredients.map, and so this will loop over them and create a new array that we can then use. And so in there we then have access to each of the elements, obviously. And so what we're going to do for each of the elements is to actually call a new function that I'm going to create in a second, which is render ingredient. Or actually, let's call it create ingredient, because it will not really render anything to the screen. So we will not create real DOM elements here. Okay, so create ingredient. Let's put it up here. It does need to be exported. And so this is just what I put into the function ingredient. Yeah, now it's correct. And actually we don't even need this, because such as before, we're actually just going to return a string from this one. Okay, so where's the code for this? And here we go. Whoa, what's happened here? Let's go ahead and put this right. And all right, now all we have to do is to replace this stuff here. So first off, we have the count, which is ingredient.count, remember. Then we have the unit, which here is gram. And then finally here is the ingredient itself. And right now I'm actually remembering something, which is that in a recipe, there's still something that we have to do. Okay, but let's leave that one for later. I hope I don't forget that I have to change something there. So this here will return this string to us that will then be put into this new array, but we don't want an array here, right? We just want a string. Okay, so the result of this here, we will simply join it. So join it, and that's it. Okay, so again, this here returns an array in which each of the elements is the markup for one of the ingredients. Okay, but we don't want an array, of course, inside our HTML. We just want regular text. And so we can simply join all of the elements together as a huge string containing the markup for all of these ingredients. And of course, once again, we could have done this all inside of this callback function here instead of separating it into a new function, but I think it's much cleaner having it like this. And with that done, let's actually test it out. So we have a search controller, we have the recipe controller, and now instead of logging it to the console, we want to render it, obviously. So first off, we clear the loader. So just like before. And actually we don't have any loader yet, so we first have to put it there in a second. But let's just start by putting the recipe view.render the recipe. And now we of course have to pass in the recipe. And so where's the recipe? Well, it is at state.recipe, obviously. Okay, so this clears the loader, but we still have to render the loader. And we do that right at the beginning here at prepare UI for the changes. Right? So we need to render the loader. And now we need to pass in the parent, remember. So we always need to pass in the parent so that the loader knows where to actually display itself, basically, okay? And so this one here is now at elements.recipe, remember? So the element that we just created before. So we render the loader, then we create the recipe, get the data, calculate all this stuff, then finally clear the loader once the data is back, and then render it. And so let's test it out now. And you see that it's already doing some stuff here. And that's because this one here is still active. And whoa, indeed, here it is. So we have our homemade pizza here. So the time, the servings, all of the ingredients, it's all there. And also here the author. But let's test it out here. Right, pizza. So let's try it with this one here, for example. And now I see something. So we have to clear this old recipe before we can load a new one, okay? So let's wait for this one and then take care of that clearing. So next up we need to clear this up, okay? So recipe view, and then simply export. So elements dot recipe dot inner HTML set to nothing. Okay, and so now each time that we want to load a new recipe, we first need to clear it. So recipe view dot clear the recipe. Okay, so we clear the recipe, then we render the loader, and then all the rest happens. So let's search for pizza again. And now we have these two spinning here, but that's no problem at all. And so we have our best pizza dough ever. Let's take a look at this one here, for example. But I can already see that everything's working just fine. Right? Oh, this looks delicious. Okay, so yeah, this is already working just fine. Now remember that I said that I needed to change something here in the recipe model. And that's because here we have some of the units, but there can be other units like grams or kilograms. Okay, and so in that case, we cannot really recognize it as units because, well, in here, for example, where we find the index for the unit, we test if it's included in the unit short, and unit short does not include like grams or kilograms. And so let's add these to this array. And what I'm going to do is to actually create a new array simply called units. And now I'm using ES6 destructuring. So remember, I can use these three dots to destructure units short. And what this will do is that basically it will separate it into its own components. So basically what this means is that instead of having an array inside an array, we will have all of these elements. So it will take these elements out and put them here. Okay, and then we can add like kilogram or just gram. Okay, so now all we have to do is to change it from units short just to units. Okay, and so now we can recognize kilograms and grams here as well. All right, now I'd already loaded because of the save that we did. So whenever we save something, then it reloads and it already has the hash here, and then it just loads the last recipe, which is actually perfect. So that's exactly what we want. Now let's just look at this example here, for example, and you will see in the ingredients, let's wait for it. Yeah, so you will see like this 4.5, 1.75, 0.25, and that's, well, that's not really ideal. So we want it back to like 1/4 or 4.5, like we had it initially, okay? And so we have to implement a function for doing that. So take a small break and see you in a second in the next video where we're gonna do exactly that.